Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about starting a studio. So I'm Daniel Norton, photographer here in New York. I do videos like this about business, about philosophy, about technique. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, please subscribe and let's get into it. So I was talking a bit in a few other videos about my studio setup, and I got a lot of questions about, well, not just my setup in general, but just studios. Like, how do you get started? Like, what do you do? And one of the things that I did and that I recommend that people do is actually share space when you're first starting. A lot of times, one of the largest investments that you might have in your photo business is going to be the actual studio space, if you choose to shoot in a studio. There are certain types of photography that you don't necessarily need a studio, and there's other types that you need a studio, and then there's some types that you could rent a studio as you go. So it really depends on your business model and what you're doing. So for instance, I'll take one of the very first jobs I ever had out of college was I worked for a wedding photographer. It was amazing. Um, and he had a little, I guess you'd call it a portrait studio that was basically, he had like a two-car garage, I guess, or maybe a three-car garage, and one of the sections of it, it was walled off, whatever, but part of that building was his studio. He actually had a part of his house too that was like a sit-down conference place and show people prints, but then he had an actual studio set up there where he more or less just left lights pretty much in place, and had a tripod and the thing, and he would do, high school pictures and the kind of the more standard backdroppy kind of shots. Obviously, he did outdoor pictures and stuff too, but he had that set up just for when he needed it. Sometimes I guess engagement pictures that people wanted him inside, maybe if it was the winter or whatever, and they didn't want to go outside. So this was also a different time period too. I think people are much more loose about wanting to shoot outside now. It's a lot easier to shoot outside now because digital, you can shoot faster. So that's a whole, maybe that's another topic. But so we had like a little studio there, which I think can work. If you, depending on the work you do and your comfort level with people knowing where you live, you could have some kind of part of your house set up as a studio, and if that's the case, then that could probably work out pretty well for you, depending on where you live. There's different regulations and blah blah. I'm not a police or government official, so you're gonna have to look that up for yourself as what you would do. But you can basically set yourself up, and generally you can write off part of your house's your expenses, blah blah. So if you're doing portraits, let's say kind of standard portraits, and you feel like you're in an area where you're okay with people coming more or less to where you live, then that might be a good option for you. But for most people, I think that's not necessarily going to be the way it is. So one thing you can do is you can either, well, take on a whole burden yourself, and that, depends on what you're doing, I guess. Share, look for a studio that's available that you can share, or start a studio space and then share with other people. And I guess the third thing or fourth thing might be in that case would be maybe rent by the day. So depending on where you are, this is going to vary greatly. I am in New York City. There's tons of studios in New York City. There's all options for every person. Whatever you might think of, there's a space. So, I'm going to talk in a more broad strokes. I know people are going to probably say, well, where I am, this isn't available. Well, okay, well, work with what you got, I guess. So the first thing I'll talk about is the simplest, which is looking for space that you can rent by the day. Now, this is for the situations where maybe you don't shoot that much, or maybe you're just starting and you want to do test shoots and you want to do them in a studio environment, but you don't have one. So you could look into a place that you could rent. There's a website, this is a website, but it's an app too, I guess, called Peerspace. I think this is in most big cities. It might be other places too, where people actually list things that you can rent. And you can rent conference rooms, you can rent offices, and you can rent spaces that might be good for a studio. So even if you can't rent an actual photo studio space, you might be able to rent a space that you can shoot in. Other options that you can rent by the day, which aren't as good but might work well for you, might be some hotels allow you to rent conference rooms, that are empty. They don't have a big table inside of them. They're basically an empty space, and then you bring in chairs or whatever. So that empty space could be a studio for you for the day. So that could be something to look into. Obviously, if you're going to set up in a hotel, you want to be pretty clear up front that's what you're doing, so people aren't like, why are you bringing me to a hotel? That I wouldn't recommend renting a hotel room unless you really know the person well and you're doing something very specific and you need the room itself. Maybe it's a suite and it has like a sitting area or whatever. I don't recommend that. That can come off as being a little sleazy depending on the work you're doing. So I'm talking conference room that you can get to from the lobby. You don't have to worry about, going through rooms to get there. I've done this before for various things, usually for a conference, actual meetings and stuff where people are out of town. but you can certainly shoot in those spaces. So that's an option. Maybe there's a dance school around that has a, you know, or a martial arts school that has empty space that they use, where you could probably rent. You know, maybe they don't have classes all the time. Maybe they're willing to rent it to you. You know, be creative. There's space around. All you really need is an empty space that has, you know, an area to put your equipment that you can get in and out of. That's pretty easy to find. So that might be a really good option when you're very first starting. So option two, or whatever number it might be, just starting something yourself. I think if you're going to just start a studio yourself, you really need to either, one, have clients, so you're probably already past the point of, you know, maybe you've already done the other options, or have some kind of a contract. I would not just randomly get a space, pay a big rent to rent it as a photo studio unless you just have that income to spend, because it's kind of expensive, and if you don't have the customers, you might find yourself, you know, just dumping money into this. So unless the business really needs it, I wouldn't immediately get a space yourself unless you know you have the customers. So, you know, I helped a company set up a studio, you know, and they set it up interior to them. You know, they basically hired me to set it up because they were going to hire photographers to come in and photograph their products. So, you know, let companies do that. You don't need to be setting up and paying for that yourself unless you know you have the customers. This is much different than it used to be. It used to be you needed a studio. You know, now not as much. I will say that where I am in New York City, and when I first came here, and I did a lot of my work with shooting models for agencies developing models, and a lot of these, you know, you're very young people or whatever, or people that aren't from New York and it's new, they're not sending people to your apartment. So if you don't have outdoor locations to shoot in and meet up and things like that, you're going to need something. And that's where kind of the share space comes in, which I think is kind of ideal and what I get a lot of questions about. So I've gone through multiple studios when I've been in New York. The very first one that I was in, was the very first one? Yeah, basically the guy had the studio. He was the only one in the studio. He was pretty successful. And then he was going through a time where he wasn't shooting as much, AKA needed money probably. I mean, I don't know his financials. And he brought me in, and basically I paid a certain amount of money to be able to use the space. He gave me a little bit of storage. It was basically his studio. You know, this was his studio. I got to use it a certain amount of days a month for a fee. That worked out really nicely. Obviously, from his point of view, he made sure that I had insurance. He checked me out with a background check. He, you know, looked. I mean, I was at the time I was already established, so like he could look and see that I was working, and people saw things. So it was easy enough there, I guess. If you don't have any, you know, history as a photographer, that might be trickier with a random person. But, you know, just like getting a roommate, it's a risk that people take, right? So if you have the space and you're looking for people, just be cautious who you bring in. I mean, you never really can tell. But, you know, if you be careful, you're going to generally be in a good position. What's interesting, it was my second studio. I had a client who hired me to do a project. It was actually a calendar. He sold vintage aprons, and we did this kind of like vintage style apron project that he was going to sell them on his website. So we used the photos for that, but also he was going to try to sell it as like a vintage calendar. So anyways, and then long story short, he was also like an amateur photographer. Like he was trying to break into photography, and we started talking a bit, and it just worked out timing wise that we just got a space together. So we just looked into it, and I was busy enough. You know, already I was pushing the limits of how much I was supposed to use the studio I was in, and he wanted a space. So essentially, we got a space together. He had basically a side office, and I had a studio, and that really helped because both of our credits down on it, all, you know, two people spreading the money out between the electricity and the internet and all that stuff really helped. We had that small studio for a while. It was really nice. And then I got rid of it because I was doing mostly larger projects that I didn't need a studio, or I should say I couldn't shoot in any studio that I could ever afford. I mean, there were big projects that were, you know, catalogs where like we were renting big studios, and yeah, I couldn't own a studio like that. It would be too much expensive, and I wasn't shooting anything in mine. I was using like an office, so I got rid of it. Which I kind of regretted after a couple of months, because what I realized was, and maybe this is another video, is that it sucks not to have a space to shoot when you need to. Because one thing I didn't even take into account, I was just looking at actual numbers of, oh, I don't do jobs here so much. I was shooting a bunch. You know, I was test shooting, I was meeting people, I was testing new techniques, and then once I didn't have the studio anymore, I was like, I didn't have a place to do that, and it kind of was bad. So I think it's always good to have a place to shoot if you're that kind of photographer, so keep that in mind before you lose your studio. So long story short, eventually I was like, I need a new studio. So I got into the one that I'm currently in. And when I first moved into it, there were fewer photographers. We all paid more. We basically split the rent. We split it three ways, and it worked out really well because we had a variety of different styles and we didn't ever overlap each other. And there was only a few of us. As time went on, we started to realize that the studio was empty a lot and we could bring in more people, but then things start to get more confusing. So one thing that we did and we do is we basically have a shared calendar. We use Google Calendar. It's pretty easy. Everybody puts in the calendar when they want to shoot. And if you have a conflict or you need something with somebody else's date, you can always reach out to them. Sometimes people are flexible, sometimes they're not. And that's basically how it works. It is the simplest thing. I will say that I've gone to a lot of studios to possibly share, and usually they say certain things like, you get this day or that day or whatever, and it's all very hard calendar. And I find that to be incredibly limiting to an actual working photographer. It's one thing if you're just doing it as a bunch of friends and it's like, okay, well, you have Tuesdays because that's your day off or whatever. But if you want to actually do jobs, you need to be available. So we're very loose with our calendar. We use, like I say, a Google Calendar to track everything. Everybody's always constantly talking to each other, and it works out really well. So some of the benefits of sharing a studio like this is that we're not all masters of every type of photography, right? And even if we were, even if you did everything and you were all like super great, you always need to be learning and growing. And the best way to do that is to be around other photographers. Being around photographers, talking about their work, how they shoot things, the gear that they use, their approach to certain things will help you grow even if it's not the type of photography that you do. I learned this super early on when I started being a photo assistant. I went into that a little bit at one point, but when I moved and became a photo assistant, of course I wanted to do fashion, but I realized quickly that I needed to take every job I could because I had no money. So I worked for, food, I worked for product, I worked for, travel photographers. And what was amazing was I learned so much stuff that went back into my work that I would have never thought that I would use. So sharing a space is similar. Whenever we intersect or start talking, everybody does stuff a little differently. You might see something new in the studio, be like, oh man, you got a, such and such piece of equipment. Well, how do you like it? Because you all can ask me and whatever, right? But I don't know you that well, right? So if you're asking me, should I get a softbox? It's like, I don't know, what kind of work do you do? When you're sharing a space, you have a feeling for what people do. So like I know, let's say how Paul or Seth works. So if I see they bought a certain piece of equipment and I ask them about it, I have a good idea of how that would relate to me. So just that close connection to other photographers is fantastic. We also, in our studio, we have kind of an open area where we put kind of, I don't want to say shared equipment because it belongs to people, but equipment that we're fine with other people using, such as C-stands, Apple boxes, backgrounds, stuff like that, like the auto poles. Those stay in like a shared area. That way, everybody has access to it. So I might only own 3 C-stands, but Seth owns 4, and then Paul owns 2. Next thing you know, we have a whole bunch of C-stands, so when we're all working, we don't have to have a gazillion stands. And actually, it works out really well because I have way more stands than I leave at the studio. But if everybody brought their own 10 stands, we'd have so many stands we couldn't move. So, we share that stuff. We share Apple boxes because, again, they take up a lot of space. Sometimes you need something. I mean, back in the days of film, you might be like, oh man, I need some extra film. If somebody has film, you could call them, hey, can I get, or borrow a lens, So having this kind of internal structure is really, really good. And you can do it even if you're just starting. If you've got like 4 or 5 friends that are all photographers that all want a space to shoot, that all kind of, are doing their thing, you can get a space pretty cheap together, And with that space, you then put all your stuff together in a sense of, shared stuff. Maybe one person has, a set of auto poles for backgrounds. Maybe another person has C-stands. Maybe another person has, certain other equipment that other people can share that they feel comfortable with. Obviously, don't share stuff you don't feel comfortable sharing. I've even been in studios, I shouldn't say been, I've even known of studio shares, like the things I've been offered, where there was even like a kit of lighting and stuff that was part of it. Those were a little bit weird to me because they were generally in spaces where they didn't expect you to bring your own stuff. It was more like you paid into something and you got to use that. That's not really my style. I like to use my own lights. And that kind of stuff because I feel like that it's, I just feel more comfortable doing that. Stands and stuff, who cares? But anyways, that's the neither here nor there for this. But the long and short of this is that working together, and I mentioned this a lot, community, having a space together is so important. You know, yeah, it could be cool to set your garage up as a studio, but then you're only with yourself, right? If it's worthwhile and you have the money to do it, to share a space or to even to rent a space or to be part of a meetup or whatever, where you have access to not only possibly borrowing people's gear, but also insights to what they do. Also, maybe an assistant to help you. You know, maybe sometimes I need somebody to help me with a project, and one of the guys can come by and help. You know, especially if it's a test shoot and like I don't have money for actual assistance, it might just be like, hey, I'm figuring out how to use this piece of gear. You want to come help me? If they learn too, you know, it really works out. So, all that being said, what about you guys? Do you share spaces? Does people have studios that are watching this? I feel like some of you must have studios because I definitely see, you know, photos and stuff that I'm tagged in on Instagram from people and they look like they're shot in studios. So that's pretty cool. I'd be curious as to what people have and how they do it. Oh, I should mention, Tom sent me this t-shirt. So, you know, if you want to send me free t-shirts. No, but that's cool. Thanks, Tom. I always appreciate when people send me things and that's pretty cool. People do ask a lot where I get my t-shirts from. So this is from Tom. I'm pretty sure he sent me a link. In fact, I'm sure he did. I will try to put it in the description. So if you guys want to get a t-shirt from Tom, you can do that. I sell t-shirts too if you want those. But anyways, you know, I'm gonna start doing that because I get asked these questions about things that I wouldn't necessarily think that you guys would ask, like things like that. So also, if you've noticed, I'm not on the porch. It is very cold today. The winter's here, so I decided that I may still pop out there if I have something really quick to talk about. But in the scheme of things, I'm probably going to shoot inside for these philosophy videos. So I should mention too, it's not just that it's cold, but so I originally started shooting on the porch because, you know, I had something to say and I had the camera and I just walked out there and that's where the light was. It was a nice little soft even light. It was easy and I'm lazy. So I set it up and that's how that whole thing started. Well, as we get deeper and deeper into the winter and I can't always schedule when I do these things, you know, I was like, you probably hopefully didn't notice, maybe sometimes you did. I was putting lights out there or using diffusion to get the light to be right where I was trying to shoot. So I was taking time to set everything up. The whole point of the porch was that it was supposed to be easy. So if I got to set up lights, I might as well not be cold. So I'm inside for now. Like I said, I might go back out, but hopefully, you know, the vibe in here is nice. You know, it's I'm relatively warm. I still have my coffee. So let me know what you guys want to see. I've been, you know, again, I've been asking this in videos because I'm trying to, and going into 2020, I really want to do more. Now that I kind of have everything, you know, I went into it before 2019 with way too much on my plate. Now I've actually got my stuff kind of in order. So I do have more time. I want to do more videos for you guys, make this more of what I do. So subscribe if you haven't already, ring the bell, and we'll get more videos out to you as soon as I can. And I'll see you next time.